to Diving Deeper Discussions. I'm your host, Randy Isaac, on behalf of the American Scientific Affiliation, and we are discussing articles and publications in Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith. Right now, we are pursuing publications in the March 2023 issue, and today we focus on a book review. And the book review was written by Dom Helsmer, and the book to be reviewed is A Christian Field Guide to Technology for Engineers and Designers. And there are three authors, Ethan Brue, Derek Schuurman, and Steve VanderLeest. All three of them are here. Welcome to the program. Ethan, say hello.
Thank you. Thanks for having us on.
Derek?
Yeah, lots of familiar faces I see here, so thanks for coming.
Right. Steve, introduce yourself.
And hello. I also see a number of familiar faces. Glad you're all joining us today.
All right. Okay. So it's great to have you all three here. And so as usual, let's start by getting a little bit of background on you. We're not going to be able to go in as deeply on each of you, but we need a little bit of perspective on your background and how you came to this. So you've told me that you're listed alphabetically rather than in any order of degree of contribution. Okay, that's fair. So I will go alphabetically also. So Ethan, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? Where were you born and raised?
Yeah, I suppose I call myself a rootless middle American, and in many ways, grown mostly in the Midwest here, from the woods of Minnesota to the prairies of South Dakota, and then found my way to a place called Dordt University, sort of on, didn't know much about it, but it was that place where it had an engineering program. And I think my background, faith-wise, was so multi-denominational. I had grown up in so many different Lutheran, Baptist, evangelical traditions, and I came across this reformational tradition that just had a wonderful unfolding of scripture and culture. And I think that's
so you attended Dordt as an undergraduate and majored in engineering. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly right. So that's
so where did you go do your graduate work?
I did my graduate work at Iowa State University. So I did a master's and PhD in mechanical engineering related to combustion and energy related fields there, and then worked in industry, in a power industry down in Kansas City, and then also in the biotech industry for DuPont or Pioneer Hybrid in Iowa before I came back teaching.
Okay. And how long have you been at Dordt?
It's 23 years now that I've been at Dordt. So
years. You're much too young for that. My goodness. That's great. Okay. So I'll come back to you a little bit later to understand how you all got together, but let's quickly hear from Derek a little bit. Derek, where are you from?
Yeah, I'm a Canadian, and so I've been a member of the CSCA for a number of years, and grew up in Toronto. Attended the University of Waterloo for my undergrad and master's, studying electrical engineering. Spent about 9 years in industry working with embedded systems, and then feeling a tug and a call to teaching, and went back to finish a PhD at McMaster University in the area of robotics and computer vision, and then took on a job at Redeemer University in Hamilton, Ontario, and spent about 15 years there teaching computer science and learning how to articulate, the connection between faith and technology. That was sort of a place where I really grew as a Christian scholar. And for the last 6 years, I've been at Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. In
6 years now. What about your faith background?
I grew up in Reformed circles, specifically Christian Reformed circles. Went to Christian schools along the way, but to be honest with you, it wasn't only till later in life that I was able to tap into the riches of my tradition to connect the dots between my faith and my profession, my vocation. But yeah, I grew up in Reformed circles.
Okay, very good. Steve, let's turn to you. You're in Grand Rapids now, right? But where did you start?
I grew up in the Grand Rapids area, and went to Calvin for an engineering degree. Went to Michigan Tech University in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan for my master's, and then did my doctoral work at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. I taught at Calvin in the engineering program for 28 years. Had some consulting work on the side at that time, and I am now full-time in industry. I am working at the Boeing company.
Are you really?
Yeah, so doing some avionics works there. Focusing on software that flies the airplane and making sure that it's correct and it's safe.
That's
my faith background is also Christian Reformed for most of my life. I did get some, especially during graduate school, was at a Baptist church for a while as well. I do some genealogy, family tree work, and I've got at least one branch that I can trace all the way back to the Protestant Reformation, and I can see faith through every one of those. It must be a dozen generations, so it's kind of
that's great.
Connected.
Yeah, cool. So let's back up a little bit. You said Urbana-Champaign, University of Illinois. What years were those? You got a fellow alum here, so
92 to 95.
Oh yeah, that's right. You're a youngster. Okay, that's great. Yeah, I was visiting campus almost every year those years, but that's cool.
It's a big campus, so yeah.
Right. Well, I feel much more at home now. We finally got some others here with experience in industry, so we share something in common here, and it's not a majority at ASA, but we got quite a few of us who are interested in that. So let's dig in a little bit in terms of how you came to write this article. I'm not sure who the lead was or how this worked. Which one of you would like to start and kind of give an indication of how this article came to be? Derek, you want to start?
Sure, I could jump in. So yeah, it was the 2015-2016 year. I found myself as a visiting professor at Dordt University and working alongside Ethan after having worked at Redeemer for I guess 15 years prior. And so I came in as a visiting professor, and I don't remember exactly who, but it was perhaps an administrator there said, we need a book on faith and engineering. I had written Shaping a Digital World about faith and computing several years before. And someone said, we need something for engineering. And I kind of thought, yeah, that's a lot of work. I'm not so sure I have the time and energy to do that. And they sort of doubled down. They said the Andreas Center here at Dordt is willing to support you in that effort and provide you funding for whatever expenses might be involved in bringing people together. So I talked some more with Ethan, and we said, why don't we give Steve a call? We both knew Steve from the Christian Engineering Society. We had crossed paths numerous times. And Steve and I had actually done some writing work together in the past. And so we used the funding from the Andreas Center to bring Steve in. And I think, they can correct me perhaps, but I think we sort of banged out the chapters as they almost stand to this day in that first weekend of talking together and sort of thinking about what shape that book might take. We were inspired by the book Responsible Technology, who some folks here might be familiar with, which was published by the Calvin Center for Christian Scholarship back in the 1980s, but was somewhat dated. It was a little bit long in the tooth, but had some really solid foundational material inside of it. So our original thought was to rewrite Responsible Technology in some shape or form. And as we discussed things further, we sort of realized maybe what we need is a different approach entirely. And so the book, as it sort of stands, takes a different tact and is a little more, I think, friendly introduction to the topic of faith and technology, and certainly an updated one. But that's where the seeds were sown, and then we chipped away at it for a number of years, and it was released almost a year ago to this date, almost about exactly a year ago. Yeah.
Okay, so Ethan, you're a colleague of Derek's at that time, right? So is that how you got drawn into this?
Yeah. You'd think these processes are really rational in terms of how they come together, but I think it was more just something that happened at Casey's Bakery here in town. So I think it was good donuts and coffee, and then, hey, I think we could do this together. So it's amazing how maybe we didn't think it through a lot at the beginning, but it started off with conversations that had been going on for 10 or 15 years and began to just morph into extended conversation with chapters unfolding from there.
And it might have felt like it was thrown together, but I think that you can see God behind the scenes. At least 10 or 15 years before that time, I had been working with someone I considered my mentor, Charlie Adams, who was at Dordt. I was at Calvin, but I had connected with him because of his writing and thinking about connecting faith with the vocation of engineering. And we had thought about a book. Tragically, Charlie was in a horrid accident and was not able to really continue teaching or thinking about writing. And so I kind of put it on the shelf. But Charlie had told me about this up and coming faculty member that it was his protege, Ethan Brue. And over the years, I got to know Ethan. And so when Ethan and Derek came to me about this book idea, I thought, it's funny how God comes around and makes an opportunity where you thought he had taken it away. So I was just delighted to be able to join them to continue a project that Charlie and I had envisioned and never really got a chance to pursue.
Now, Derek said that he had known you from the past, but I don't think he said how the two of you met.
The Christian Engineering Society, my other mentor at Calvin, Jim Bosher, and I helped start an organization for engineers who were Christians who wanted to put their faith and their vocation together. And we started it as a series of informal meetings that met every 2 years. And in 2016, we finally got to the point where there was enough people that we formalized it into a 501c nonprofit official organization as the Christian Engineering Society. And Derek had come and participated in a number of those conferences. So he and I got to know each other through that over the years.
Okay, that's great. So what other resources from ASA have focused on this topic? I think, what's the title of the one you just mentioned that you revisited? That was, I'm drawing a...
Responsible technology?
Responsible technology, right. There's been some other engineering efforts in ASA as well, hasn't it? Was it Jack Swearingen? Didn't he?
Yeah, he did. Yep.
A while back. Yeah,
that's right. His book is referenced in ours. Yep, that's right. I did an article, Randy, when you were back, I think you were the editor at that time. I did an article just comparing engineering and science. And I nudge back a little bit at my colleagues on the science side that say engineering is just applied science. And I wrote an article to say, I think each one could be viewed as an application of the other, and they really are almost a dance where engineering provides tools for scientists to further discover, and those discoveries help found the next set of tools. And so there's an interesting back and forth that happens between them. So that was a few years ago. It was in the ASA Perspectives Journal.
That's great.
ASA has long had an engineering sort of subgroup that sort of has, they maintain their own Facebook page and they interact at meetings. We sometimes gather together at the annual meetings. And for about a decade or more, I've been serving as the book review editor for Books and Technology, working alongside James, who's also here, Jim Peterson. And so the ASA, and occasionally the ASA has published papers in computer science and engineering along the way in the journal. So those discussions have been going on for a long time. But I think the goal of the book was not to speak to other academics, but to provide an invitation to undergrads to sort of think about how faith sort of informs their discipline and their studies. And so we sort of wrote it not to other professors, although, we hope some of them will find it helpful, but to invite new undergrads at Christian colleges, I guess, because that's what we were thinking about as Christian college professors, but also hopefully more widely at state universities and secular places where Christians are studying that subject matter as an invitation to thinking about it.
Yeah. So, Steve, that article you mentioned, I was never editor, so I never got involved. I do vaguely remember it, but if somebody could be so kind as to put the link to that in the chat, then we all have it as a reference, because I'd like to go back and read that again. I'd kind of forgotten about that, and I do remember looking at that. So, okay, so that gives us a bit of a perspective, and I think that will help us get into the content and the details a little bit. So Becky, let's open the field for allowing people to unmute themselves. And as usual, we're going to start with those who submitted questions in advance. And we have the trusted input from Del Kuhn again. And so he is our first. Thank you very much, Del. I really appreciate it. And so why don't you ask your question to the authors?
Hi, Randy. Thank you. And to say, I really appreciated the book, and I even suggested a subtitle for it as not for engineers only, but for everybody else. And maybe realizing that in a 4-year education, people don't come out with very much ethical background. What do you recommend for new graduates or engineers to develop their ethical and moral basis over the decades of their careers? And I'm not looking for a guess on what's going to be hot in 2040. Just what are the habits that you'd like to see people doing so they're as competent ethically as they are with engineering?
I think one of the quick things that I would start with is I'm hoping that this book and our conversation begins to just open ears and eyes of engineers to see beyond the artifact, beyond the technology, to the user, to the community, to the maintainer, to the producer, and see that anything that's shaped and formed in creation always has tentacles in so many different areas of culture. And before we can even talk about ethics, I think we need to see those connections deeply, how they shape communities and it's just not a way that engineers typically think. They're quite often focused on the artifact and how that works and the physical capabilities of it. So I think that's the first start in that conversation of ethics.
Yeah, and we actually have a whole chapter dedicated to ethics as well, where we try to expand the conversation beyond sort of the classical discussion of deontological versus virtue versus other types of ethical frameworks, consequentialism. And also where we kind of say we need to think about more than just looking at case studies, which are often used in engineering education, and think more holistically about a variety of different aspects that come into play when we're doing engineering work. And we have a whole chapter that Steve wrote on what we refer to as design norms. But then to get at another part of your question, what sort of practices do people need to engage in? Our final chapter in the book is called Letters to a Young Engineer. And it's basically a series of letters between an older, somewhat graying, upper middle-aged professor and a young engineering grad that's just starting out in industry. And in those letters, the older professor kind of encourages this younger professor in terms of some specific things that arise in his work, but also just encouraging him to develop certain practices, like being involved in a local congregation, a local church, remembering to set aside time for Sabbath, trying to practice certain spiritual disciplines, which I think are essential to shaping us into the kinds of persons who sort of know how to respond to situations as they arise. So yeah, it's a combination of things, but we come back to these design norms in our ethics book, which in our ethics chapter, which leans heavily on a chapter about design norms that Steve wrote.
Mm-hmm. Steve, you want to comment?
Yeah, one thing that I think I've often seen is, at least for engineering students, that they first start thinking of their faith obligation is just simply to behave correctly in the workplace, don't lie to their colleagues, respect others in the workplace, and so forth. And it takes a little bit and some maturity to come around to realize that what they are producing, their actual job of creating and inventing technology, should also be influenced by their faith. So it's not just simply personal interactions, but their specific vocation should be shaped and influenced by scriptural principles, by their faith. And starting to recognize that, then I think opens your eyes to going back and even in daily devotions, recognizing in Scripture where the principles you see there can be applied directly to what you're doing in engineering. principles of stewardship or justice, two of the design norms that we call out, are biblical principles that should influence how you think about designing a new technology, whether you should design it, how it should be designed, who it should serve, who the stakeholders are all influenced by our faith in biblical principles. So I think the practice is to just be aware and be looking for, in that sermon you hear on Sunday and the daily devotions you do, that these things are not just something for Sunday, they are something that applies to your everyday life. And of course, that's true whatever your vocation. Our book points out, including engineering.
Yeah. If I could just follow up on your answers, that's one of the things I really appreciate in your book, that in your proof texting, you've got pretty much the complete quote from Jeremiah, emphasizing the welfare of the city that you find yourself in. That ethics is not just, I'm not going to lie to my boss, but, in 30 years when I'm a department head, I'm going to think about whatever, alternate sourcing of raw materials or something. So again, excellent book. And I like the fact that you go beyond the personal aspect of it into the social and organizational consequences of what people are doing.
Yeah, if you think about the call to love your neighbor, we all have a greater responsibility, I think, because our neighbor has expanded through technology. We now have neighbors that we connect with that aren't physically next to us, but we interact with all the time. Those are our neighbor. How do we care for them? So all of us have that responsibility now. For those designing technology, we can care for our neighbor by providing eyeglasses, for example, providing hearing aids, for example. Those are ways to care for our neighbor through technology.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, so I encourage all of you to comment. Just raise your hand on the thing, and I'll do it. But pending that, I'd like to dig a little bit deeper on a key aspect that I've been thinking about for many years, and that is the notion that you emphasize in the book, that technology development is not neutral. And, that was first brought home to me in Jack Swearingen's book, actually. But as I thought about my own career and how to apply that, I admit that I struggle. Because, I understand that it is correct, but I struggle with how to actually implement that and what does it mean. I think as many of you know, my career was doing the research and development on the chip design, integrated circuits, and all the transistor designs. And I still have a hard time understanding how that kind of technology development should not be considered as neutral. Because in a way, if I'm at the transistor level, my job is to make that transistor behave as efficiently as possible. And it's hard for me to understand where that moves away from its neutrality. So can you help me with that a little bit?
I think one of the things I like to start with here is I think we have a tendency to think about neutrality as a middle ground between good and bad. And I think one of the ways we want to steer people away from that is when we say technology is not neutral, we're not necessarily saying that it's somewhere either better or somewhere worse. It's just that it comes with and here's a dangerous word, agenda. In other words, it enables certain things and it doesn't enable other things. So I don't know, I sit here in front of this Zoom meeting and I think, I have to comment on this because this discussion, I'll just be honest, would have been beautiful if we could all be in person, right? In other words, I could read everybody's nonverbals so much better. And discussion and dialogue is somewhat cumbersome and not free-flowing when you're doing it on Zoom. That's what it disables. But what it enables is that we're all over the country and we can have a discussion together. So It's not neutral. It doesn't enable the same type of discussion, but it does open the door to some things, but it does slam the door to a quality of discussion that we can't necessarily have because of the technology or medium. So I think that's one of the nuances I'd add to that is part of the discussion of neutrality is not about whether something is good or bad, but that it does always come with what it can and cannot do better. And a realization of that is important. So,
Okay.
Randy, even at the level of the transistor, when you said the job was just to make it as efficient as possible, there's already a choice involved there. Are you making it as fast as you can, even if it uses more power? Or do you balance that with energy conservation so that it can be used in a mobile phone as opposed to a supercomputer? So even at the level of just looking at the individual trees, not the forest, you can sometimes see there are choices that are being made there. And once you've made that choice and designed the transistor one way or the other, it's now biased to either be very fast or maybe very power efficient, maybe not quite as fast. So I think sometimes you just have to step back and say, well, you don't ever sell a single transistor, right? It's part of a larger product, but it influenced where that product could be used. It's back to Ethan's point, right? It is enabling of certain directions, maybe not so much in other directions because of the choices we made in designing it.
Well, that's true. And I could give an awful lot of examples of that, but typically our figures of merit are combinations. I mean, you have to have maximum speed at lowest power, and
yes, absolutely,
and we get fairly complex figures of merit that we have to achieve, and so that seems to me a fairly abstract way of connecting. I mean, it's simply reducing the power or the energy consumed. Making that an issue of ethics or a larger piece it seems fairly far removed to me, and I don't know. I don't quite get it yet.
Yeah, I think if you also just look at what the transistor on a chip has enabled, right? I mean, it's not neutral in the fact that it's basically driven Moore's law, which has fundamentally changed the fabric of our society. And so you see the technology is also part of a bigger trend, right? It's not neutral in that. The famous media ecologist, I think it was Neil Postman, said, you think about, you have a drop of red dye and some water, and you add a drop of red dye to water. You don't have a drop of red dye and some water. You have a whole new substance. And when you think about the ability to put thousands, millions, billions of transistors on a single chip, you don't just have more electronics, you have a whole new society. So the neutrality also, the discussion about non-neutrality and about value ladiness also shapes how these technologies transform other parts of our culture, right? And so,
right.
And there's other things too. Like just to throw in another thing too, it's also where you source materials, right? So Intel has a big push now for conflict-free minerals, and what do we do with? I mean, the very chemicals and manufacturing process of making these things can be problematic as well. So thinking about those impacts along the way. So it's multidimensional, and the fact that you said we had multiple considerations is a good start. In fact, the book encourages engineers to sort of, avoid this tunnel vision where you're just looking at a few technical parameters and zooming out and seeing that a technical artifact has social, environmental, economic, cultural, right? All these other sort of bigger issues, and to be more aware of thinking about that more holistically.
Right. Although, when you're in the lab and doing the work, you're really optimizing because you want to sell this thing, and
Right.
and you want it to work for the large volume kind of products.
Yeah.
And that's what we really focus on. And I have no idea what these transistors are going to be used for, and we recognize it can be used for virtually anything.
Well, not quite. If you think of if you sell a tool of a hammer, people are going to tend to pound things with it because that's what it feels like it should do, is pound things. It's biased towards pounding. If you sell them a screwdriver, they could pound things with it, but they're not likely to. They're more likely to screw in a screw with it because that's what it feels like it should do. Almost every technology is going to feel to the consumer like they should do certain things with it. Could they abuse it? Yes, and we have to account for that and try to prevent it in the future. But there's going to be a certain bias. In fact, I'd say part of our Christian responsibility is to help the consumer, the person buying the product, to understand how to use it well, to understand to use it according to biblical principles. So not only do I want to follow stewardship and justice, for example, if I'm doing my job well, the technology will help the end user pursue biblical principles themselves. If they don't, if I find that they're using their technology in bad ways, I should be thinking about what the next generation is to try to prevent those abuses.
Okay. All right. We can probably return to that later, but we've got several hands up. So, John Wood.
Thanks, Randy. That's a fascinating question you're asking. It just, my mind just went spinning as you guys were responding, and it really gets us into the heart of these questions. I think Steve, you pointed it out earlier. This whole contextualization of who we are and how we become and what we do. So the first thing I thought was the Cain and Abel problem. When Cain shows up and he has his conversation with God about his sacrifice and what he'd been doing, clearly there was a whole bunch of other stuff that isn't in the text. It's not in the story that's going on elsewhere. And so I thought about that in terms of, like, Randy, you say, well, I'm just sitting here. My job is to do this. And I think, can we actually do that as believers? Can we just say, my job is to do this? And can we narrow the field down? And I don't know what they're going to do with this thing. It's kind of like the story about the guy who retired from the railroad up in the mountain pass. His job was to go out when the train stopped, and they had to check their brakes before they descended down this mountain pass. His job was to go along and tap the wheels and listen to the sound. And he did that for 25 years. Then he retired, and they said, so somebody said, well, why were you doing that? He says, oh, I don't know. My job was just to tap and listen to the sound. Well, the point of him doing that was to determine whether the sound changed because the rail had heated up from a frozen up brake. And so I don't think we can ever just say, I'm just doing this. It feels like there's much more going on there. I'm really struck with the Bitcoin discussion that had been going on. Finally, that whole system has collapsed, and people are much more cautious. But early on, environmental people said, look at the kinds of energy consumption that's going on here. And just, of no other thing but just that contextualization. And then I saw people, for instance, in churches saying, well, we'll accept Bitcoin for donations. And I'm thinking, that isn't really a direction we want to go. But it is if you don't look at the context. But if you do, and so I think there's a really important discussion. This is hard. It's not easy to do this.
This connects back to Dell's question in a way when he was saying, what should you do as one matures or moves up in their career? I think that managers who are Christians actually should be looking for opportunities to provide their supervisees with a vision of the context so that they're not just making a gear and having no idea what it does, not just tapping a wheel and not knowing why, showing them the why in the bigger picture, because that enables them to do their job better and lets them see what are the good choices I can make. So when you have greater responsibility, that should flow down to those that you interact with to help them see, how does this work in the big picture? Who is our customer and how are they using the product? So you get your job done, but what's the context you're doing it in?
I fully agree, and that's not unique to Christians. No matter what your faith, that's what a good manager should do.
Absolutely.
Very much so. Okay, thank you, John. Terry.
So, Randy, I wrote a little comment, but I think you don't read them as they're coming. But common, that is that we share this activity with believers and unbelievers, isn't the same as neutral. And I think it's pretty important that we make that distinction, that while you and your unbelieving fellow engineer or whatever discipline you're in might be doing similar things, they're actually tying into a creational reality that is subservient to God and his will and purposes. And they may not acknowledge that, but you as a believer do acknowledge that. And so there can be a lot of common ground between what a Christian does and what a non-Christian does in the workplace. But the non-Christian is actually doing a Christian or creational work just by doing, using God's creation in this normal sort of way and productive sort of way. So, I just want to, tweak your question a little bit. I don't want to call it neutral. I want to call, the unbeliever, if you will, is doing Christian work and, creational work, if you will. And it's good and it's to the glory of God, and it can be accomplished good in the world. So it's common, and they're not using it kind of appropriately in the religious sense, but it's still good labor that is under the creational norms that God has made, and they just don't admit that or acknowledge that.
Don't recognize it. Yeah, I understand. That's a good point.
I think that's a good point on the intersections that we find. We land in the same place with our Christian and non-Christian engineers quite often. As we diverge from that common point when we're designing the same thing, we begin to explain the things of why we're doing what we're doing. And then we also begin to try to explain why we can do what we're doing. And then quite often we get into a bit of divergence from there. Then we begin to see our differences. But that doesn't mean we don't acknowledge our shared humanity with them. And many times get that same path going forward is a good one. But I think that's always important to remember. There's not this unique, distinct Christian path that stays distinct and separate. There are commonalities with humanity that we do share.
Can you give some examples of where that divergence might occur?
Yeah, I would say, this on the web. Sometimes it would be, say, even in our approach to environmental stewardship, we land in the same place quite often when we talk about use, productivity, trying to minimize impact, those kind of things. But when we start getting to the why and the roots of why we care deeply about creation, we can begin to diverge a little bit. Some of us say it's ultimately, even though we trust God, it's ultimately because we love what he loves that motivates us to care deeply for the creation. Others might see it as a survival mechanism. We won't last unless we save our world. And so we have just a slightly different posture, even though we may be working to that same local end. So,
but your divergence there is motivational rather than the actual work.
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, sometimes it does dig deeper into theories about how the world responds to things and even interpretations. So okay. There also gets to be those as well, which are more complicated on the why side.
Okay. Well, maybe later. I'd still like to hear an example or something. But anyway, sure. Bill, you've got your hand up, so let's hear from you.
Yeah, well, I think my question will lead into some of the stuff you're talking about, Randy. The authors know I love the book. My quotation about it is inside the front cover of the book, saying how good it is. But the thing that really struck me most about this book probably is the very point that technology is not morally neutral. I came to that conclusion a long time before I met Steve and the other authors. But I have a hard time communicating that with my students at Baylor as well as faculty. But I think a great example is in the first section of chapter 3. Someone who's a hero in kind of a lot of engineering, certainly civil engineering circles, is Robert Moses, whose buildings and roads and bridges transformed New York City, particularly Manhattan, in the 40s and 50s. And on page 38, you have the provocative, but I think very truthful statement that says, Robert Moses built racism into his bridges. That he deliberately built bridges and underpasses so buses carrying poor people can't get into some of the nicer parts in the city of New York. And I think that's, to me, an example. Partly it's motivation, certainly, but also it's the issue that the result of that was to keep the wrong sort of people, in his opinion, out of the city parks.
Yeah, in fact, not just poor, but specifically the Black population, because they tended at that time in New York to use the bus system heavily, and whites tended to use cars heavily as their transportation. So those bridges were designed to let cars pass through to get to the beach, but were too short for the buses to go through. So literally building a racial bias into the design of the bridge. Now that's an egregious example. I hope no one would, today would do such a thing. But I think you might, without thinking about it, do such a thing, not realize that you had built a bias against a certain group of people. You might design a video game that tends to be biased towards male rather than female players. You might design a window that tends to be biased to tall people versus short people. So in a way, caring for your neighbor means being thoughtful, thinking through not just how would I use it, but how would others use that design and how do I enable them to use it fruitfully?
Mm-hmm. Well, that kind of bias in usage is really tough when you're at the leading edge of the research and technology, because generally new ideas are not widely accessible. They generally are going to be deployed first in subsets of population, depending on what it is. Those who can afford it. The richer set is where you're going to cut your teeth at it. And it's only later, that it becomes affordable and more widely acceptable. So to me, it's just really hard to implement and apply that kind of thing. I mean, I agree with it, but I don't really have a good handle on how that works out in the early stages of research and development.
Engineers have to anticipate safety issues before they happen as well.
True.
It's really hard, right? Well, so we have some responsibility to think through how might it be used, but we're not expected to be perfect. We're expected to be fairly thoughtful, to have foresight. Was it reasonably foreseen? And Christians should reasonably foresee beyond just safety issues to how would people use this to good or to evil. But if something happens later that no one foresaw, well, now you should go and say, can we correct this through revision of the technology or through regulation? Maybe people didn't foresee that automobiles would result in fatal accidents until later. And then we started requiring driver's licenses to say one must be trained to use this equipment. It's dangerous. We've learned now. So, yeah, Randy, I don't think any of us are saying you should perfectly predict every usage.
No.
But we are saying you have to be thoughtful about it at the beginning and as you see those patterns emerge.
Yeah, I'm not interested in perfection either. I'm just trying to think, what would I at that stage do differently as a Christian and somebody who wasn't? And
we have an example in the book of the game Pokemon Go, where people were using their phones to catch Pokemon with visual reality, trying to see where they might be. And some people realized that they could lure somebody into a forsaken place where they could mug them. They'd purposely lure them there. Well, the Pokemon designers never thought that might happen, that it would result in a mugging, but then they built in some safeguards once they learned that, right? So, yeah, it's a matter of iterating on it. Once you see that there's a bad usage, what can we do to prevent that?
And the design norms are intended to provide a framework for thinking more broadly than just about the narrow technical specifications that engineers are often hyper-focused on. So the design norms are a way of, they don't give you trivial answers, but what they do is say, hey, when you do zoom out, these are certain areas that you should be conscious of, that you should be thinking about, you should be reflecting on, and to imagine what might go wrong, not only just technically, but also culturally, socially, environmentally, and so on.
Right. Okay, good. John, you're back for another round. Go ahead.
I am, Randy. This is such a fruitful question, a line of questioning that you're pursuing, because I think you're putting your finger right into the issue that this book so helpfully addresses. Is it, what do we do? And in our life, one of the brilliant things about modernity and science is that we've been able to reduce things down to smaller and smaller. We're able to focus. And so I can be very efficient. I can just do what I do. And that's a good thing. Like, I don't have to worry about where my food's coming from because I know where the grocery store is. And somebody's paying me a good job. So all of that gets taken care of. I said, well, what's my responsibility for ethically raising animals or marketing and the rest of his health and safety? And that's part of this complex of modernity where we have layer upon layer of institutional structure and boundaries. And now we're in a spot where where it's really possible to do a job and know nothing about what the implications are, what in the world it is you're doing. And yet, I don't think we're free. I'm sitting here looking at a couple of books that I've got, Modern Technology and Human Future, a Christian appraisal by a guy named Craig Gay, Religion and the Technological Future, Biohacking, Artificial Intelligence, and Transhumanism. And then one of mine that's really touching is called Race After Technology. And it's ethnicity. They're talking about race. They're talking about the kind of unexpected hidden bias that gets built into our technological structure. As Steve, you were just giving an egregious example, and yet there are many of those. And so I think, Randy, to your point is, yes, this is really a tough question, and it's hard to know practically what you do. And I think I heard Steve and Bill get at this. You have to teach students. You've got managers have responsibility. It's Terry's point here. As Christians, we have responsibility here to think deeply about this stuff. And of course, I'm drawn back to the work of the ASA, the work of our affiliates, the work of the Christian Engineering Group. It's to inform each other and to help us do a better job, because this is not easy. It really isn't easy. But I'm reminded of the rule in ecology, the Aldo Leopold rule of ecology. You cannot merely do one thing. You take hold of one organism in an ecosystem and you start to pull it like a thread, and the whole universe is tied to it. And I think that in engineering, it's very much the same. To that transistor is this whole network of stuff that's hidden, and yet it brings with it. And so the comfortable thing is that up until recently, we've kind of been in a place where we could assume the kind of we could make assumptions about things, and we could feel safe about the technologies we were working on because it was fairly obvious. Today, it's not very obvious whether it's Pokemon or Facebook, the digital technologies, or I mentioned Bitcoin, or the AI. We've got the founder of AI, the Canadian guy, who's on the news this week saying, wait a minute, this is not a good thing. We need to stop and talk about this. We may be really doing ourselves in here unintentionally. And so I think it's a wonderfully important conversation. So.
Yeah, and I think your point is well taken, and that's I fully agree here that our calling is very much to say that we are called to think about things much more broadly than just the myopic view of what am I doing right now here. How does it fit in the bigger picture, and how does it go? And that's something I think in ASA we can continually encourage each other to do by example and so on. That we need to understand that higher implication, the broader implication of virtually everything that we do. So I think that's very good. Thank you.
Building on what Steve said, I just want to remind us that engineering technology is iterative. In other words, I guess the easy way to say it is we will be wrong. And I think that is a very good place to start, is we will be wrong. And if you know your history, or if you're humble enough to learn your history, you'll learn that we took some pretty well-educated guesses that did not turn out well. And I think that's a healthy way that Christians can also approach the reality of being human and shaping the world. So.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point, Ethan. All right, Fred, you've got your hand up.
Okay, so here, Ethan's, Derek, and Steve. Here's an interesting setting for you. I was talking with a pretty old fellow about 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and he had worked at Westinghouse in Western Pennsylvania. And in about 1940s, he was being asked to tool a kind of structure that he'd never seen before, and he had no idea what it was for. And then it was being taken somewhere after they built it, and he asked the driver of the truck, "Where is your truck going?" And they said, "Oh, somewhere out in the middle of nowhere in the middle of Tennessee. And then a year later, he got a letter from President Truman saying, thank you for making the war end sooner.
Aha.
So just here, I'm just open-ended question. What are your thoughts about that? So.
Can I mention, comment on that? Just a couple of weeks ago, University of Maryland hosted 4 of the very mature atomic scientists, Roald Sugdev, Richard Garwin, John Holdren, Frank von Hippel, very senior leaders talking about the status of nuclear weapons, nuclear disarmament. Basically, it's in a dire situation now, and they've shortened the doomsday clock to 45 seconds. These are some of the world experts in the design of nuclear weapons. So they are competent engineers, but they are also basically, they all agreed that we should get rid of these things, whether it's unilaterally or bilaterally, we should get rid of them. They're no good, they're useless. So it's just an interesting lesson in what you guys have been talking about of the consequences and how they get realized way down the road. And of course, this was a case where we had a short-term need that turned into a long-term burden on the world.
Technology certainly makes people more powerful, and nuclear weapons are one of the most powerful technologies. And unfortunately, we're not perfect at figuring out how to use our technology. So those very powerful techs like nuclear are extremely dangerous. I wish we hadn't invented that. Yeah. However, we also have to deal with the fact that might it be invented somewhere? And now what do we do once it's been invented? So can we prevent proliferation? Can we detect its use? Can we prevent its use? What can we do now? So I think, we can regret that it was invented. Once it's invented, whether it's AI or cloning or nuclear technology, now it is our responsibility. Now it's in the world. So, we live in a messy world that sometimes we have to deal with that. That Westinghouse engineer, I don't think I blame him. He didn't have any way of knowing how it might be used, and he tried to learn it. So it feels like, to me, he pursued his responsibility as far as he could. We all have contributed through tax dollars, by the way, to nuclear technology. So we all should be thinking about, what do we hold our government accountable for? What is my influence? And can I influence as one taxpayer? Not much. Should I have some influence? I should try.
Yeah, one other point that comes along with that, the new movie Oppenheimer is coming out this summer. And it would be great to have a discussion about the movie actually in a forum like this with ASA. That would be great. But I'm kind of curious to see how they portray Oppenheimer, because there was this classic kind of quote from Oppenheimer that, if you see something that's technically sweet, you go ahead and do it, and then you figure out, the consequences afterwards. And I think that's sometimes the attitude of folks in Silicon Valley and other high tech areas, right? Is this relentless pursuit to pursue something that's technically sweet, without thinking about that sort of wider picture we talked about a few moments ago, and that's where responsibility comes in, I think.
But there's some epistemology involved here. I mean, it's easier to detect what is technologically sweet than it is to detect the consequences.
I think, though, that engineers can be caught up in what they're doing because of the sort of, I think even engineering education tends to encourage a kind of tunnel vision. Because you're so I think it's a kind of posture, and of course it goes along with the humility that Ethan suggested too, to having this posture of knowing that we don't really know, and maybe that ought to set sort of the timetable for how we unleash new technologies and what we do when we discover issues, and how we iterate towards more normative sort of products. But that's another thing, and maybe that's where regulations come in, right? Maybe there needs to be, and this is, I know, controversial, but the idea that maybe we need as a society to think about, when new things come out like ChatGPT or some new, potentially disruptive technology, where we say, look, we need to tread carefully and make sure that we unfold this in responsible ways.
Okay, Fred, did you have some more here, or you still have just a hand up? You're all done? Okay. Del.
Yeah, thanks. That was one of the things that comes out in the conversation is a lot of these things are competitions between different goods, not a clear good and bad. And this, I think, is where you're making the point about engineering being iterative, or any kind of product development as being iterative. You do something, as far as we know, we're trying to do something that's good. The opposite might be trying to accomplish a different set of goods or a different hierarchy of what, quote, the good is. But that doesn't mean that's where we stop. And I think it also doesn't mean that that's where we decide that the people who are opposed to it are evil. We could spend the rest of the decade probably thinking about the winners and losers in energy development as we're decarbonizing our electric grid. Not all decisions are going to be intentionally bad, but there's going to be an awful lot of unintended, likely unforeseen consequences. So let's maybe step back, recognize C.S. Lewis's point that the conquest of nature is really the ability of one person to control another person using nature as the instrument, and try to be as moral and ethical as we can, and be the jerk in the coffee room that's bringing up the what if question. But let's just recognize that we're all let's give people the benefit of the doubt that we're trying to compete between different goods, and not we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. So anyway, great discussion, great examples. And I guess we're still arguing Hiroshima.
And will for a long time. Yeah. Any comments on that, guys? Nothing over there. So I'm still thinking about this technologically sweet versus the outcome of it, because there's like two aspects many aspects to it, but there's one is in terms of what do you and I as Christians and we like to think of ourselves as morally responsible, ethically responsible. But then you have the set that you've got a whole community of people who are familiar with this technology and will understand it. And so you and I may choose not to go some particular direction, but to what extent can we control what other people do? I mean, we see this, how difficult it is in the DNA and the genome, and what do you do in the embryo? It takes an enormous effort to get agreement with the whole community of what should be done and what isn't. And it's hard. And as we've seen in various examples, the Chinese embryo work, that someone somewhere in a lab is going to end up doing it. And it's very hard to control. And then we kind of get into the dilemma of our controlling other people with our own idea of what is morally the right thing to do. So these are not trivial issues. I mean, one is just what you and I will be doing and what we think is right. But what is our society or a broader technological community going to do?
There might be two dynamics that we are dealing with here. One is the sweet side that Derek brought up. And I think it's good for us to realize that as human beings, there is a playfulness with creating things that drives us. I think there's a creativeness in scientific discovery that we just want to dig in and want to know more. And I don't think we have to say that's bad.
No, in fact, it's part of the Imago Dei to have that creativity, right? We can point to a theological reason for it.
But it's like getting carried away with a game. That's the challenge. We almost have to restrain ourselves. There's too much fun here to be had. At the same time, we can acknowledge that there are people out there that may be pursuing things for pernicious reasons, and that also is going on at the same time that this playfulness and this joy in creating and discovering is there. So there are competing tensions here as we try to sort out these really complicated issues.
And I think there's personal responsibility. What job, how are you using your skills and how are they being directed versus how a particular technology is being used more widely. And I think, those of us who are members of groups like the IEEE, I'm a member of something called AI and Faith, which is an interfaith dialogue about AI, are able in our professional capacity to actually join broader conversations about how these things ought to be unfolded. And I think despite all the uncertainty and hype that is probably around AI right now, there's certainly a renewed interest in ethics and talking about AI ethics in professional organizations, including ACM and IEEE as well. And so I find that really encouraging. I think as Christians, we can engage in what Abraham Kuyper called principled pluralism, right? Working within a society where many people have different beliefs than us, but working alongside them to sort of nudge things towards the common good, towards flourishing by finding common cause with people who don't necessarily share our beliefs, but understand that there's consequences for going against the grain of God's creation. They wouldn't call it God's creation, as someone mentioned, but, so I think there's opportunities to work more broadly, also as citizens,
right,
with influence on government regulation and so on. But so it's that whole spectrum. But also, I think we can't just discount our own responsibility by saying, well, I don't do it, someone else will. There's a really interesting article in the New Atlantis called The Architecture of Evil. And it's all about the guy who was Hitler's architect and his civil engineer. And he said, I was just following directions. I was just solving technical problems. But he built the whole infrastructure for the Nazi empire and only later on realized I should have been thinking more about to what ends these things were being used for. So it's a fascinating article.
Okay. Bill, another comment?
Yeah, I'd like to continue on this one aspect that I think is important, and that is sometimes we are talking about, with like example, the Hitler's architect designing things that are going to be used directly for evil. But sometimes it's between the issue of how do we decide between two different things that we both think is good. An example I've used with my engineering students, and we don't have a simple answer, is when you're making a complex structure or part or machine, you want to make it easy to manufacture or easy to repair. And those both are things we'd probably say are good, but if you go to one extreme, you're not going to be able to do the other one. For example, I once had in the early minivans era, I had a minivan in which you had to take out the front driver's seat to get at the engine. Now that was clearly designed to make it easy to make, but it certainly didn't make it easy to repair. So sometimes we are faced with two good things and we have to decide how to balance them out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, engineering is almost always about trade-offs and often between good things, and not necessarily just two things. It might be 20 things that you're trading off between. And I think one theological piece to that I found helpful is to think of two limitations we have as humans. Even before the fall, we were still finite creatures, so we cannot anticipate everything. We cannot imagine everything. We are finite. After the fall, we're also fallen, so our decisions are always clouded by sin. And so I think as we're thinking about creating technology, using technology, we're always going to have those two limitations. We should be, to the best we can, overcoming those, right? As redemptive agents, we should be fighting the effects of sin, but they're always going to be there. Even aside from that, I think we have to recognize in humility, we are creatures, we are finite, we are not God, and we will not be able to foresee how to perfectly trade off manufacturability and repairability. To my finite mind, I don't know I do both of those perfectly, so I got to find some balance.
Right. No, and I want to pick up on what Derek said before, that I think you really hit it right, that we need to talk about these things. And that's I think, the great credit of your book and why I really appreciate what you put together, because we're not out putting answers. I mean, this isn't like there's an answer key here somewhere, but raising awareness and getting it out in the open for people to think about, which is really what we're called to do. It's one of the key functions of ASA here, to have that dialogue, to get the conversation going and keep it going so that these things are at the top of our minds going on.
And the conversation needs to be more than just engineers talking together. We need social scientists, we need theologians, we need philosophers, we need the whole breadth of sort of human.
We need Terry's grandma. As he put on
we need everything. And I think that makes ASA richer too, right? We have theologians, we have scientists in conversation. I think that's a model of what that kind of conversation should look like between engineers and theologians and social scientists and whatnot.
You're spot on. I mean, this is what ASA is about, a multidisciplinary dialogue on these issues. And that's what you guys have really contributed with. So, we got another hand. All right, Paul.
Yeah, Randy, I want to pick up on your comment earlier about the your own work at IBM, and you're working in a commercial environment where you're driven by competition, and you have to keep working hard and coming up with new ideas and research and improvements, because if you don't, somebody else is going to beat you competitively. And of course, the same kind of thing happens between nations. And as we were just saying about nuclear weapons, if we hadn't built them, somebody else would have, and it may have been a lot worse for the world. So we have, in a way, I'm thinking that nations are all they're all born in war. They all end in war sooner or later. And as we're in this reality where money sets priorities for what we do. We don't just do things because they're technically sweet. We do things because we get paid for it. And so there's a sense in which the entire world, society, is driving the priorities of things. It's not just us sitting around as individual engineers having fun. My own background was in underwater acoustics, which is a very heavily funded field. How odd is that? Because it has to do with nuclear submarines and deterrence. Anyway, I've been working in nonprofits lately, and in fact, I should mention that Derek and I are partnering on a poster session at the next ASA meeting to talk about a really cool product that he developed that allows people in a very poor environment, somewhere in a remote place, far away from the internet, can do internet-like communications and education with a local server. And so we're going to be working on that. And it's an example of, I would call it a philanthropic, non-competitive based product that is just designed to help poor people that could never afford the kind of technology that we can. Yeah. So that's unfortunately, nonprofits don't get a lot of resources. So these things struggle along at a low level, and thank God there's lots of people that do this out of the goodness of their hearts. And I'm familiar with some retired engineers around here who do that. But I think one of the background issues in terms of Doyward's aspects is the economics of what we do. And that always needs to be thought about. Money drives a lot of what actually happens. And there's fields that may deserve a lot more research. It doesn't happen because people don't see a profit in it. Another example is vaccines.
Yeah, so just to quickly, for those who might be interested, the project is called Archie Pi. Archie is an acronym for Another Remote Community Hotspot for Instruction and Education. So it's a Raspberry Pi based product that actually acts as a Wi-Fi hotspot, but it's just chock full of educational materials and Christian education materials and podcasts and links to content from Wikipedia and from other open resources. So we hope to be presenting on that. Another example is we're having a workshop before the ASA conference for AI. And so there's an AI workshop where we want to start talking about the wider issues and also working with developers. So we're encouraging developers, people working in industry to come and talk about how do we unfold this powerful new technology in helpful and encouraging ways. So that's the purpose of the pre-conference workshop. And I encourage anyone who's thinking about that to apply.
Yep. Okay, so we're past our hour here, and I don't need to cut off any burning questions, but I just wonder if Ethan, Derek, or Steve, would any of you like to leave us with a closing observation of the one little thing you want us to remember about your book? That was a resounding.
Yeah. I mean, I can quickly say, feel free to contact us if you're a member of the ASA and you read the book and you have a question or comment. Certainly, Ethan and I are at a public on a public website that you can find our contact information. I hope to be at the ASA conference, so if anyone wants to talk further, feel free to seek me out there. And yeah, we hope that this book will be a helpful contribution to the ongoing dialogue, that there will be much more that will follow.
That's right.
The minute you write a book, the realization hits you that you only scratched the surface. And so we would love to hear more questions, more challenges, continue the conversation. So
a follow-on book. How about that, Ed?
There you go. Thank you. That's been a great conversation. I love the questions and all the thoughts that you threw out there. Appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation with all of you.
And thank you for joining us. Thank you for writing the book, and see you all next month.